The Quintessential Show. Quintessentially South African.
It is the Quintessential Show. It is the movers and shakers. They gather here to discuss all things South Africa. Today I welcome the author of In Math We Trust, Bitcoin, Cryptocurrency, and the Journey to Being Your Own Bank. It is Simon Dingle. Simon, welcome.
Hey, Quintus.
No, listen, it's great to have you on the show today. Simon, give us a brief rundown of who you are, where you hail from, what are you currently up to?
Okay. Sure. Where I hail from is Pretoria originally, and then I spent a long time in Johannesburg, and now I'm based in Cape Town. I've been for almost 10 years. What I do is work in fintech, ostensibly, and very focused on the crypto space.
Yeah, very cool. Now, we have something in common, though. I've read that you only went to university because you wanted to work at Tux FM. And
That's right.
I did the exact same thing. I think a lot of media innovators actually came from this station. So I did a drive show between 2013 and 2015. So you were there a little bit earlier than I was, but we've come through the same institute.
Yes, yeah, no, much before you. I think it was around, I left Tux FM around 2003.
Yeah.
But yeah, I very much just went to university so I could be on the campus radio station. And the first sort of section of my career was very focused on media. I had shows on 702 and Cape Talk, 5FM, and used to write columns for a bunch of magazines, etc.
Yeah, no. So same story here, except I never went on to go write for FinWeek. I just went through Tux FM. But eventually now dipping my toe into media, and now when you do dip your toe into media, you find Bitcoin being one of the dominating topics on the interweb. And so you have written a book. I came into contact with your book. Tell me about that. Writing the book. It was originally published in 2018. Have you done a small push for the book to get extra noticed in 2020? What's happening with the book?
No, it sort of took on a life of its own. The project began when my publisher originally contacted me, Tracy McDonald, and she said, look, I think it's time for somebody to write a book on the topic. So I agreed to do it. And it came out in 2018, as you said. I'm considering perhaps revising it and doing a second edition at some point. But to be honest, the book came out and my publisher sort of ran the marketing and the PR around it. And, aside for showing up for interviews and the like, I kind of sent it off into the world and carried on with my life.
yeah. But that's the story of Bitcoin, right? I mean, this thing that comes out of 2008, 2009 is still growing and morphing into new things all the time. I actually saw you on a documentary, banking on Africa. Now, let's just talk about the volatility of Bitcoin for a second. Since that documentary, you actually said that the previous high was 20,000 on that documentary. Yeah. And since then, we've seen a high of $63,000 per Bitcoin. And now we're back to 34,804 as of recording this video. So we've come a long way down since then. Are you buying the dip?
I wish I could buy the dip, but I would be if I could be. I always think it's a good time to be buying Bitcoin, but I also don't like the fixation with price. I think, unfortunately, the story of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency for too many people is just trying to get rich quick or, make money quickly. And there's a lot more to it than that for me. So I sort of try to ignore the get rich quick part of the equation and focus more on everything else that's happening in terms of financial inclusion and re-railing the global financial system. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely know that Bitcoin will recover from this point. The price of a Bitcoin in the next 5 to 10 years has to start approaching the millions of dollars per coin. It'll either be that or Bitcoin won't be around anymore because it's not successful, or it'll be in minimal use. But if it's even partially successful at what it set out to do, then it has to be worth a lot more than it is today in dollar terms. Of course, one Bitcoin will still equal one Bitcoin, and I think there are a lot of people in the world, and more joining them every day, who don't think of Bitcoin in terms of dollars. They think of dollars in terms of Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Well, look, in your book you wrote, and I'm glad that you said that, it's not a numbers game for you in terms of what the current price of Bitcoin is. It's more about financial inclusion, because that's, with Quintessential ZA, my transformative purpose is to talk about nation building. And so I like the fact that you're on
cool.
Talking about that. Now, in your book, you write, but Bitcoin gives us a better reason to trust than gold, governments, or gods could offer. Now, I want to further preface that question, and I don't know if you saw this clip on the weekend from Max Kaiser from Russia Today. He was at the Bitcoin conference in Miami, and he ripped up a $10 note. And this is what he said. I'll quickly quote it. While he was ripping up the $10 note, he said, "This is garbage. This is garbage. You people in South Africa, you have your rand. That's going to zero. Dollars are going to zero. Euros are going to zero. The yen's going to zero. Chinese currency is going to zero. It's all going to zero against Bitcoin. If you don't understand that yet, you're going to be impoverished. You're going to be on the street. You're going to be begging. You're going to be out of business, and you're going to be toast." Your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite an extreme statement. I don't think he's wrong in terms of fiat currencies like the dollar and the rand depreciating against Bitcoin, if you will. Just given the inflationary nature of central bank currency, that's kind of a given. I don't know that they're going to zero, and I certainly don't know how quickly it's going to be. I don't like telling people they're going to be impoverished unless they do things the way I want to do them. So don't entirely agree with the extremism, I suppose. But Max is a colorful character, and he does have some very extreme views.
Yeah.
But I do think what we will see is more and more nations adopting Bitcoin in a way that El Salvador just has. So you probably saw the news. El Salvador has passed a bill now to make Bitcoin legal tender in the country, which means it's basically a national currency now in El Salvador, which is very interesting to think about. And I think we're going to see more and more countries doing that as they appreciate that we have a better form of money now in the form of Bitcoin. And so we're in for an interesting few years, but I certainly don't think we're going to see any extreme shifts in the global economy in the next year or two or three or four.
Okay, very, very interesting. But back to that quote from your book, you said, but Bitcoin gives us a better reason to trust than gold, governments, or gods could offer. Tell us why that is. I mean, for first-time viewers of a Bitcoin conversation, tell us why you think that Bitcoin is more trustworthy than golds, governments, or gods.
Yeah, because it doesn't involve human decision making necessarily, and it gives us a way to transact directly with each other without requiring intermediaries. So we don't need trusted third parties or central authorities the way that we have before. And unfortunately, almost every time throughout human history that we've put our trust in central authorities, they've let us down. Sometimes they do their jobs very well. But human beings are fallible, and more often than not, it's just a matter of time until your authorities are going to make a mistake and let you down. Not necessarily because they're bad people, but just because they are people,
Right.
What Nakamoto consensus, which powers the Bitcoin network, gives us is a way of trusting each other directly and not needing central authorities that can make mistakes. We've got a set of algorithms that function as an intelligence, if you will, that govern supply on the network, that make sure that the rules of the monetary policy on the network are enforced, and that don't require permission from gatekeepers to access and don't require intermediaries to transact through. And so, Simon and Quintus can transact directly with each other, and we don't need to trust a central authority. And so, in that way, Bitcoin is the best version of money we've ever come up with. Now, people who don't understand how it works will say, yes, but you're trusting Bitcoin. And that's sort of true in a way, but you don't have to trust. You can verify. You can go and interrogate the source code yourself. I have. The network is open and transparent. You can see exactly how it's working and why. And raw compute power is ensuring that your transactions are secure. So, it's probably the best system we've ever come up with for trusting each other and transacting directly with each other.
No, it's a good point. But now, when South Africans, dip their toe into the Bitcoin sphere, they get these two terms. They get Bitcoin and blockchain, and already then, basic education starts to go. Okay, how do I explain one and the other, and how do they mesh? Now, give us your definition of what you believe a blockchain is. Is this truly the ledger of the future?
A blockchain is just a way for a computer to prove that it's done something. That's it in a nutshell. Unfortunately, too much is made of blockchain as a technology, which isn't really the important part of the story. Bitcoin as a set of monetary policies enforced by a blockchain is a far more important narrative. So some observations about the blockchain that I find interesting. Firstly, the word blockchain isn't mentioned anywhere in the white paper for Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto didn't use the word in the original white paper for Bitcoin. That was a word that was made up later. It's also slightly deceptive because it's not really a chain of blocks, if you will. I think one of the things that's interesting about Bitcoin is the older Bitcoin transaction is, the more secure it becomes because layers of encryption are built around it. So if you wanted to crack the first Bitcoin transaction, you'd first have to crack all of the transactions that came before it. So each block, I prefer the word layer. You can think of it like a gumball that has these layers kind of building around it. It's not really a chain. That's not the right analogy, I don't think. But I think another important observation is that this technology was created so that we can transact without requiring trusted third parties or central authorities. So all of this compute, and we can get into that later, this nonsense idea that Bitcoin wastes electricity. But Bitcoin does use a lot of compute power. And the reason it uses a lot of compute power is because it turns out it's really difficult to build a network that can have trusted transactions without intermediaries and central authorities, right? Mm-hmm. That's what all of this compute power is going towards, is a system where we can transact directly with each other. The moment you have a central authority or a trusted third party required in the network, all of that proof of work and blockchain technology becomes redundant immediately. You don't need it because you have a central authority that's doing the same job now. Yeah. And so I think that's the biggest part of the narrative that people get wrong, is they think, for example, the central bank can use blockchain to build a digital rand. Well, yeah, they could, but they'd be wasting an incredible amount of compute power because there's a central authority. So it's an absolute misuse of technology. Bitcoin is designed to be the antithesis of a central bank digital currency, for example. It's the exact opposite thing because of its distribution and trustless nature. So I think blockchain is a very misunderstood term. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of hype around it. It's jargon. And so the same things are happening to it that always happens, is management consultants and enterprise technology companies try and capture this term so that they can sell their clients more things they don't need. None of their clients need a blockchain.
well, that kind of corroborates what the Valor CEO, because I had Fajar Mesani, the CEO of the crypto exchange Valor in South Africa, and he says the blockchain is not a great database and is much better suited with a native coin on top of the blockchain. So is that kind of, do you agree with that sentiment?
Absolutely, yes. I think Fazam and I are pretty much saying the same thing. The block. If you're using the blockchain for Bitcoin, it's a very elegant solution to a very big problem that wasn't solved before. If you're using the blockchain for your central bank digital currency or your supply chain management system, then you're just using it as an inefficient database, and you've gotten bad advice from whoever sold you that technology.
He says it's just people who have bad process flows within their companies that go like, the blockchain shall solve everything, and it never really does.
But that's a very important point, is governments especially are very bad at technology. Right. And big companies tend to be very bad at technology as well. And so the blockchain isn't the answer they're looking for. They definitely need to get rid of the old stuff they were using and use technology in a smarter way. But they 99% probably do not need a blockchain. They just need to get smarter about how they deploy technology.
Yeah, but once you start thinking about these principles of a transparent ledger that can't be tampered with to a degree, I mean, people do start thinking, oh my, this could change the way governments and companies run forever, type of thing. So, I mean, my thing though is South Africa, right? So 7 to 9 million South Africans remain unbanked, like they don't have access to banking infrastructure. Now, do you think blockchain and Bitcoin will assist in getting those type of people onboarded to this system of trade one day? I want to further preface that question by saying, like digital only banks have just launched, like Time Bank, for example, and they say, we're going to help people get onboarded to a banking structure. Are we going in the right direction, or should we be focusing more on Bitcoin and blockchain at this rate in South Africa?
Yeah, it's interesting. That number you mentioned of 7 million, I think you said, unbanked people in South Africa is highly contested. Some people say it's closer to 5 million, and other people say it's closer to 11 million. The interesting thing about the unbanked in South Africa is that those aren't people who don't want bank accounts. It's people who the bank doesn't want as customers because they can't make money from them, right? So the banking system kind of rejects them as customers. And I think that's an important differentiator, is in the banking system, you have to get permission to open an account. You have to apply for an account. In the Bitcoin world, you don't need permission to open an account. You just open it, right? The Bitcoin network doesn't care how much money you have, where you live, what the color of your skin is. It doesn't know any of those things. If you want an account, it gives you one. And it doesn't matter if you have 0 in that account or 2 cents worth of Bitcoin in that account. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You're allowed to have an account. Download a Bitcoin app, open a hardware, open a wallet, and you've got it. You can even have a paper wallet. You don't even need a phone. So that's why we refer to the Bitcoin network as permissionless, because there are no gatekeepers. There's nobody whose permission you need to use the technology. If you want it, you can use it. And so for me, if we think about financial inclusion, that's quite a powerful principle, especially in parts of the world where, you've got certain demographics that are being marginalized, where you've got problems, call it racism or classism, or you've got certain sectors of society that are in control and try to keep other sectors of society out, and we've obviously seen multiple examples of that throughout history, and especially in South Africa. What I like about Bitcoin is that it can't be manipulated by, any group of people. There's nobody who can say, oh, well, those people aren't allowed to have an account and those people are. And so it's inclusive by nature, whereas the traditional banking system is exclusionary by nature, right? It excludes everybody until they apply. Bitcoin includes everybody. They just have to, install a wallet.
Yeah, well, look, I've been impressed by Time Bank in terms of, look, if you have a SAID and a cell phone, you can now open an account and it doesn't cost anything to keep the account open. So for financial inclusion, I'm totally noting that. But I also note what you say about Bitcoin and the blockchain. And my thing is about introducing South Africans to the Bitcoin and blockchain. It is going to take a lot of marketing as far as I can see it. But the other side of the coin, do you see any movement in the traditional banking sector in South Africa? Will they adopt cryptos onto their platform? Do you think they'll go down that road? What do you see in the sector in terms of the development of that?
Yeah, they absolutely will. Standard Bank was sort of ahead of the curve many years ago. I think it was in 2014. They already had a Bitcoin custody solution where you'd essentially be able to open a Bitcoin wallet at Standard Bank and store your Bitcoin with the bank. That unfortunately got kiboshed pretty quickly and they canceled that project. But almost every South African bank that I know of is at least experimenting with this stuff. Some are being quite progressive. So Investec, for example, have already said they plan to launch custody services for digital assets. They haven't launched it yet, but I think it's only a matter of time before they do. The big challenge that South African financial institutions have is there's just no regulatory framework for them to operate within. So the Reserve Bank has basically put together a working group that's prepared a very good overview or positioning paper for how they consider the cryptocurrency landscape. But now regulators have to turn that into a framework for licensing, etc. So, for example, the Financial Intelligence Center has to start, making crypto companies accountable institutions. For example, the FSCA needs to decide how its licensees are allowed to deploy these instruments, and none of that has happened yet. So, if you're a bank, compliance is probably your biggest concern when you're doing anything, and there's no compliance framework for them in South Africa. So it's very difficult for them to launch products in the space. I think South African banks have a very good track record of being quite innovative. And I think they definitely would like to play in the space. They just really can't at the moment. Yeah. And then on the other hand, I think there's still a lot of education that needs to happen within the banks themselves. There are factions in the banks that I find where you'll have a couple of guys who really understand this cryptocurrency space. They've gotten their heads around it. They're excited by it, but the higher ups are still doubtful or buy into this nonsense that Bitcoin wastes electricity and blah, blah, blah.
Well, let's talk about the electricity and talk about gas fees and stuff like that, because from the user perspective, the very on the ground user perspective, I like sending 10 Rand to my friend and the 10 Rand gets there. The problem that I foresee with some form of exchanges in South Africa is that when you try and send, say, 10 Rand of Bitcoin, then there's suddenly, I don't know, a gas fee or something that is included in that transaction. And depending on how busy a network is, for example, that's going to now cost you money. Put my mind at ease about the future of sending Bitcoins. Will we be able to send one without gas fees in the future? Tell us what gas fees are, please. We need the basics.
So gas fees really is more of a discussion in the Ethereum space and other blockchains. Bitcoin has transaction fees. We don't refer to them as gas because they're computed directly in Bitcoin, and it's, I don't want to get too technical about it, but but the fees on Bitcoin are actually a lot lower than I think a lot of people realize, especially when you consider that you're settling real value in Bitcoin. If you look at the traditional monetary system, when you swipe your credit card, no money is actually moving. You're just reserving funds for a transaction. So you'll get a text message from your bank saying you just paid 50 Rand, for example. That 50 Rand is not moved from bank A to bank B, right? Just a message saying you owe us this money has moved. And the actual settlement will happen sometimes weeks later. The banks will batch these settlements and then they'll transfer the money, because moving real value around is expensive and always has been. Now, in the world of Bitcoin, when I send you a Bitcoin, I'm sending you real value. This is real settlement that's happening. It's happening at light speed compared to what banks can do. And it's actually happening much more cheaply than value can move in the traditional banking systems. But what it doesn't lend itself to yet is microtransactions, where we, like the things we pay for with our credit card every day, are making faster, smaller transactions that we need to be slightly cheaper. That's a problem that's been solved in Bitcoin with the Lightning Network and with various other payment solutions built on top of the blockchain, or what we refer to as protocol scaling solutions. So you can already use the Lightning Network to send a few cents worth of Bitcoin, and the fee will be so low it may as well be zero, and the transaction will clear in seconds. It's a solved problem in Bitcoin. So it's, you probably heard the term FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, or fucking useless data, or whatever you want to call it. But this idea that Bitcoin is slow and expensive is part of the FUD. In the Ethereum world, it's a very different discussion. And one can't really talk about Bitcoin and Ethereum in the same breath, because they're completely different things. They both use blockchain technology, but Bitcoin was designed to be peer-to-peer electronic cash. That's literally the subtitle of the Bitcoin white paper, whereas Ethereum was designed more to be a distributed compute infrastructure, or world computers, some people call it. Very different use cases, very different departure points, but both have a currency that enable them. And in the Ethereum network, when you send a transaction, the transaction fees are computed in this notion of gas. And they do tend to be quite high at the moment because there's a lot of traffic on the Ethereum network. If you look at value being settled in dollar terms, about 4 times more value is settled on the Ethereum network any 24 hours than in Bitcoin. And Ethereum networks are also more data rich, because Ethereum's used to build applications and execute smart contracts and do things that you can't really do with Bitcoin, not in a good way yet. So Ethereum is transferring a lot more information. It's transferring a lot more value. There's more activity on the network, and that means that transaction fees are higher. What's happening on the Ethereum network at the moment, however, is new protocols are being introduced. There's one in the news at the moment called EIP 1559, which is designed to alleviate the gas fee problem in some smart ways. And then in the longer term, there's the move to proof of stake, where traditionally blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum use proof of work, where you're using hash cycles to basically guess the answer to a sum, and in so doing encrypt blocks of transactions. It requires a lot of compute power. Ethereum is now transitioning to proof of stake, where instead of using compute power to qualify for encrypting transactions and earning fees and rewards, you're actually staking. So you're paying for the right to encrypt transactions. And the hypothesis is that will be a lot more efficient and introduce lower fees into the network, which we've seen, play out in other blockchains. So it's a reality that Ethereum is quite expensive to use relatively, depending on what you're doing, of course, because if you're transferring $1 billion, then paying $5 to do so is probably a bargain. Yeah. But if you're buying a crypto kitty for $20, then it's not so much of a bargain anymore. But sure. Ethereum will get cheaper. I think it depends when the full transition to proof of stake is made, but my personal feeling is in the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to see gas fees getting a lot cheaper.
Okay, that's fabulous, because there's a lot of starving artists that want to create NFTs on an Ethereum network, and the problem is you need a pretty penny to now get your artwork onto that actual blockchain. So I want it to be as low as possible for South African artists specifically, because we can inspire innovation in South African arts with NFTs in the future. But I think my major gripe. Well, go ahead. Do you want to expand on that?
No, I was just going to add that it's quite interesting if you are an NFT artist and you start thinking in Ethereum, then all of a sudden the whole equation is flipped on its head. If you're selling a piece of art for 1 Ethereum and it costs you 0.0001 Ethereum to list it, in dollar terms as a percentage of the transaction, even so, it's not the end of the world. But I suppose it depends on the value of your art.
Sure, yeah. There's some artists out there that really want to put like a $600 valuation on a piece of art, and you're like, wow, okay, you're going to have to pay quite a bit in gas fees to get that up there.
Yeah. Although it did cost a lot to actually ship a painting to somebody in the past, so I suppose you have to think about the full distribution cost.
I like that. But like we said, in the real world, environmentalists are now talking about computing power and how Bitcoin is one of the dirtiest currencies around the world, and this is some sort of Twitter explosion of environmentalism that's going on. Talk to us about that. There seems to be a lot of pushback on Bitcoin because people's computers are running all day, or the mining rigs. Where does this come from?
So you can't actually run Bitcoin on your computer, not successfully anyway. Because Bitcoin mining is so competitive, it's converged on a particular architecture we call ASICs, which are application-specific integrated circuits. It's basically a computer that can only run one application, and that application is Bitcoin. And so that's where most of the mining happens. And those computers are quite power hungry because they're doing a lot of work. So a few thoughts on that. Firstly, turns out you can't do anything without power in the world, whether you want to play video games or drive to work, or everything requires some degree of energy. Yeah. The only real question is it worth it, right? So if we have the ultimate store of value, finally a true digital currency that's native to the internet, and the world is increasingly storing its value in something like Bitcoin instead of gold, that's quite a big value add. And if you look at the amount of power that's being consumed to gain that, it's the most efficient store of value we've had in history. So it's much cleaner than gold, for example. It's also interesting to think about the US dollar, which is literally backed by oil and blood, right? The US military is, if you think about it, the cost of backing the dollar. You think about the wars that have been fought over the last, 7 or 8 decades, the amount of money that's been poured into conflicts in the Middle East, etc. It's I'd say the dollar is probably the dirtiest currency in history if you look at the human cost, etc. Then you look at the thing that Bitcoin was designed to replace, which is the conventional central banking system and private banks with it. If you look at the resource consumption by a single big Wall Street bank, I think, and again, we don't know what these numbers are, but one can assume that if you have several buildings downtown New York with the lights on all night, massive data centers, an army of thousands of executives, all of which are rich enough to have multiple holiday homes, their own private jets, Range Rovers. Like, I would venture that Bitcoin probably, in terms of resources and not just raw energy, consumes far less than the traditional banking system does or did. Unfortunately, a lot of people will tell you that's whataboutism. I don't think it's whataboutism when you're discussing the thing that you're directly trying to replace. Secondly, because Bitcoin mining is so competitive, it tends towards the most sustainable forms of energy, because sustainable energy is, of course, the cheapest energy you can get as well. And your biggest overhead as a Bitcoin miner is the price of electricity. So a large majority of Bitcoin mining is done on sustainable energy, specifically hydroelectric power, because one of the interesting realities about power generation, however you do it, is that you almost always have an excess. Hydroelectric is notorious for producing excesses of electricity that before would just be wasted. Like, we'd produce more energy than we need and it would be wasted. The same is true of a lot of solar energy projects, wind projects. And the worst is gas. So, of course, we've had a lot of fracking in North America and elsewhere. And a lot of electricity production is done using this natural gas that's now been released through the fracking process. We won't get into whether or not we think fracking is a good idea, because that's all different can of worms. But for better or worse, you now have these gas power stations, and they also produce an excess. There's more gas than they can use. And what they used to do in the past is referred to as burn off. So they'd literally just set it on fire into the atmosphere and waste this gas. Whereas now, if you've got excess gas available or excess power in however you're producing it, you can have Bitcoin mining equipment at the source plugged in, actually capturing that value for something useful. And so you can think of Bitcoin as a money battery, some people have called it, where instead of wasting that excess power now, we can actually put it to work or store it, that value, because it's fungible value, and use it for something else later. So I actually think about it, if you look at the big picture, with Bitcoin being a green technology, I actually think it forces us to use more sustainable electricity. It gives us a way to take electricity being produced in places where it was very difficult to get it back to the grid and actually store it as tangible value. I think its contribution to sustainable energy production is a net positive, massively. Another thought on that is that people overestimate the amount of electricity that's being used by Bitcoin. Unfortunately, there've been very bad reporting on this in the media. For example, there was one article, and I won't cite the source, but they basically said that a Bitcoin transaction uses as much electricity as a US household does in a month. That's nonsense. And it turns out they were looking at the cost of an entire block, which is like, call it 10,000 transactions. And it wasn't a month, it was a day. And so they just completely botched the numbers. There's also been a lot of FUD spread by financial institutions that don't like Bitcoin. So, for example, in 2017, American Express ran an advertorial about Bitcoin wasting electricity. So they were purposefully spreading this misinformation about Bitcoin to try and attack it. Now, fortunately, American Express has turned the corner and they're actually experimenting with cryptocurrency themselves. So they've seen the light, but that was then and this is now. And the damage is done in terms of the misinformation. And then you can also start comparing Bitcoin to any number of other things. So depending who you ask, YouTube consumes somewhere between 1% and 2% of the world's electricity. Is that worth it?
Wow.
I think so. YouTube is amazing, but
yeah, I mean, it's facilitating this conversation right now, Simon.
So, but Bitcoin uses about 1/20 of the electricity that YouTube uses.
Wow.
And it gives us a better financial system. It gives countries like El Salvador hope that they can turn their economy around. It gives us a better store of value than gold.
Sure.
So is it worth as much as YouTube? I think so. Is it worth 1/20 as much as YouTube? Hard to argue against that.
Yeah, but you might have the FBI at your door in just a little bit, because media and American exceptionalism are joining hands again because of the headlines we saw on the weekend, which was that, the FBI seizes Bitcoin and they got the private keys through some fantastical way of hacking something. Like, people make up these misconceptions in their head of how Bitcoin is exploited. But if you read your book, that you can almost be sure that it's unexploitable, because that's what the chapters kind of deal with. So tell me about the misconceptions that you've seen surrounding Bitcoin, not even related to energy, for example. Now it's going to how well this thing is, encrypted. So tell me about that.
So Bitcoin is unhackable, hands down, no questions asked. You cannot hack Bitcoin directly, right? And so it's interesting if we look at this latest story that you're alluding to, and this is a case where cyber criminals had used ransomware to infiltrate a massive gas pipeline project in the States, which basically means you're giving them a computer virus that locks up the data on their computers and the computers themselves. And they basically have to pay a ransom in order to unlock their systems. And those ransoms are generally requested in Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency like Monero that's more privacy focused. And in this case, the ransom was paid, and then the FBI managed to reclaim some of the funds. And of course, the big question is, how did they reclaim those funds?
Correct.
And a lot of people have suggested that they might have hacked the Bitcoin network, which is like saying they did it by turning off gravity. It's not possible, right? It didn't happen.
Yeah.
What's more likely is that they tracked the private keys down to them being stored either at a third-party exchange or on a server that the FBI was able to infiltrate, or they literally physically compromised somebody who was holding hardware keys or keys in another way and actually physically arrested that person or something and seized the money that way. It's a little bit like saying, if I figure out where you live and break into your house and steal 50 Rand out of your wallet, that I've hacked the Rand. No, I've hacked your wallet and your house. I have not hacked the Rand, right? So it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the cryptography involved. There's no way for any government in the world to hack Bitcoin directly. It's not possible. It's just mathematically not doable. Yeah. And if it was possible, it would have happened sometime in the last 11 years, and it hasn't.
Yeah. But the securing of Bitcoin, for the user is a really good conversation to have. Now, yes. You deal with that in the book a lot in terms of potentially getting, your pass keys on a physical piece of paper and hiding it away type of thing. Tell me about that securing of Bitcoin, because we spoke about exchanges, and, even on the book, in the book, you say that exchanges basically own the Bitcoin that you have bought through them type of thing. Talk to me about securing Bitcoin, because I think people who want to almost, take their life savings and convert it to Bitcoin will probably want to physically hold it without an exchange. Now, how is that possible?
Yeah, so the best way to do it is to use a hardware wallet, something like a Ledger Nano or a Trezor, a Cold Key. There are various brands of them. And what these devices do is they actually store the private key for your Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency wallets on the device itself, and they store it offline. When you plug the device into your computer, all it's doing is using the link to sign a transaction. The computer can see that the transaction was signed, but the private key is never exposed. So that's a really good way to store your cryptocurrency. So what happens if you lose that hardware device? Well, nothing really, because it requires a PIN code to unlock it. The better devices will let you set a PIN code with up to 8 characters. If somebody puts the PIN code in 3 times incorrectly, the device wipes itself out. So losing the device isn't the biggest problem. But when you set up the device, it gives you what we call a mnemonic, which is a set of words, usually 12 or 24 words. And those words in that order will derive your private key. So those words, if you think about it, are a really sophisticated password, and you need to protect that somehow. So people keep these pieces of paper with words on in their safes at home, for example, or in a safety deposit box, the traditional places that we put really valuable things.
Right.
There's also things like crypto steel that people use, where instead of writing it on paper, the words are actually engraved in steel. That's fireproof, waterproof, will store the words for up to 1,000 years, and they put that in the safe. Or, and then you can get really smart and use things like 25th passphrase obfuscation, where you're actually adding an additional layer to those 24 words that you remember. So even if somebody gets hold of your 24 words, they can't do anything with it. They need the 25th additional thing that's in your head. There are various strategies one can employ. Or you can trust an exchange or a company to look after your keys for you. But it's important to understand that if it's not your keys, it's not your coins. The company may or may not be trustworthy. They will tell you they owe the coins back to you, but you've handed over custody. And so I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad idea. I think a lot of people are scared of storing their keys themselves. They don't want to deal with the complexity. They're worried about not understanding hardware wallets, or they don't have access to a safe, or there are many reasons why they would want to use a company to help them solve the problem. In fact, one of my companies does exactly that. We look after cryptocurrency portfolios for our private clients. But the big question to ask all of them is why do they trust us? And there's a reason why we don't advertise on Facebook and on the side of buses, is because people need to know that they can trust us, and usually that's because they're in my network. Also, we've seen so many scams. For example, here in South Africa, we had MTI, Mirror Trading International, which at the time of us speaking is the biggest crypto scam in history. Yeah. And a lot of people were trusting them with their Bitcoin, and they turned out to be criminals, Yeah.
But so look, I mean, South Africans have been part of certain scams when it comes to Bitcoins. Even that lady in that Banking on Africa documentary said, yes, guys, you in South Africa, suddenly all the Bitcoin scams are coming out of South Africa. So, but also, Monero is run by a South African, kind of spearheaded by a South African, correct?
Yeah, Ricardo Spagni is a fantastic dude. He's the lead contributor, I think is his official title for Monero. Of course, Monero is an open source project that, for all intent and purpose, is leaderless. But the point you allude to is there are a lot of cryptocurrency skills in South Africa.
Correct.
People like Andre Cronje, who's the founder of Yearn, is South African. The De La Riviere twins, who have made massive contributions in the Ethereum ecosystem, especially in the NFT space, etc., are South African. Stephen Young, who founded Niftify, which is a collateralized loan platform for NFTs, he's South African. Just about the entire team at Luno have done fantastic work, all South Africans. So it does feel sometimes like there's a disproportionate amount of South Africans doing good work in the space. Of course, South Africa is also one of the places where you'll find the most Google searches for Bitcoin for example. Wow. So our exchanges in South Africa also disproportionately trade more volume than most other countries, especially if you look at our, demographics and GDP, etc. So we definitely are a bit of a hub for crypto, and unfortunately that means we're also a hub for crypto scams and fraud.
Sure.
Unfortunately, South Africa is a little bit of a place where that just happens anyway as well. The amount of phishing scams that happen in South Africa, pyramid schemes. Yeah. Unfortunately, we seem to be a nation that's quite susceptible to that stuff.
Yeah, but that other side of the coin is the innovation, and that's why it's culminated in you coming on the show today to speak about Bitcoin, and that's what I'm saying. When you deal with the principles of Bitcoin, like if you read your book and you start to discover documentaries, you start to discover other books, you start to discover legitimate crypto influences, I think your mind starts running of how can we improve South Africa with this security of this digital asset class, but that also makes governments think, oh my, aren't the people leaving our system that we've fought so hard to now liberate, type of thing, and that's why what's up with the contention of Bitcoin in South Africa specifically? A lot of the people, for instance, on that Banking on Africa documentary, seem to be those influencers where it's like libertarian freedoms, no matter who says what about it. Almost on the non-regulatory side. Talk to me about the regulation. What needs to happen in South Africa for this to become the next big thing?
So a few thoughts on that. I mean, it's interesting that the assumption out there is that everybody who's interested in Bitcoin is a libertarian. I'm not libertarian. So in my book, I call myself a social libertarian, which is kind of tongue in cheek because those are two sort of opposite things.
Yeah. What about anarchist? How about that?
Yeah, call it what you want. I believe in humanity. I'm an optimist. I also I'm not sure that the entire world being pegged to the US dollar is the best idea either. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about a country like El Salvador declaring Bitcoin legal tender is I think part of that is an appreciation that we need to decouple from the dollar. Like just having that American stranglehold over your economy is not fantastic. And so I would encourage lawmakers to think about that. you might have a really good central banking system, and we do in South Africa. We've got an excellent the Reserve Bank does a great job. Our governor is exceptional, but we're still beholden to the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and I don't think that's good. I think the Bitcoin standard would better serve us. So I would challenge regulators to think about that in terms of what needs to change. From an everyday South African perspective, nothing. I can use Bitcoin and there's nothing the government can do to stop me. So they can ban it, whatever. They can try and physically stop me from using it, but the only way to do that is to turn off the internet. So, just like when government started telling people to stop downloading movies and music on BitTorrent, it's okay, cool story, bro. But what can you do about it? Nothing, So if you can't police it, you can't regulate it. And that's, for good, better or worse, just the reality. So we're going to be using it anyway, and so regulators need to think about how they enable it instead of trying to get in the way, because all they will be is a speed bump. That said, I think they have a meaningful role to play, and I would encourage them to look to places like El Salvador that's made the right decision. Portugal has decided that they will not tax gains on cryptocurrency investments. That's very smart. Why? Because if you have a significant amount of wealth stored in Bitcoin, guess where you want to live right now? El Salvador or Portugal, because you're not going to be taxed on it, but you're going to bring all of that value into the economy. So instead of thinking about how you can police it and stop it, rather think about how you can enable and embrace it, because you're either going to do that or not be around 10 or 20 years from now. This is the way the world is going. You kind of need to deal with it. And I always tell the story of Microsoft, for example, that was combating Linux and open source software, call it 2 decades ago. And they actually spent millions of dollars on a campaign called Get the Facts, where they tried to spread misinformation about Linux having terrible ROI and being insecure and blah, blah, blah. But the reason I like the example is because Microsoft turned the corner. They eventually realized that they were not going to beat this thing, that you can't stop an open source movement when you've got a critical mass of people doing something in a decentralized way. You can't stop them. And Microsoft embraced open source. And now, in fact, Microsoft are arguably the best custodians of open source software in the world. If you download the latest version of Windows 10, you get the Linux kernel with it. They really did embrace this stuff. But I think it's human nature to be scared of new things. And we see this every time there's a new technology. When novels were first introduced, we had the Gutenberg printing press, and novels were one of the things that in the early days of the printing press was starting to be mass produced. There were a lot of hysterical articles and people saying that novels were going to be the end of society, and people reading too much fiction was going to cause all sorts of psychological problems. That wasn't true. When FM radio was first launched, something you and I both share passion for, people believed that FM radio was going to cause schizophrenia, was one of the stories. It caused cancer was another story. Of course, FM radio is harmless. Television, when it first launched, was going to make everybody blind. That didn't happen. Microwaves were going to boil our blood and give us cancer. That didn't happen. Cell phones were going to give us cancer. Unfortunately, there's still some people stupid enough to believe that, but that didn't happen. So instead of just assuming that new technology is going to kill you and waste all the electricity in the world and boil the ocean and blah, 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 maybe think about what it could do and appreciate the fact that people who are smarter than you have been thinking about this thing very deeply for decades and making it work. And maybe take the time to find out what they think, instead of just having a knee-jerk reaction that it's going to be bad for you somehow.
Sure. And that's what I'm talking about with the development of Bitcoin and what it could mean for South Africans and artists and all of these kind of people around the world. Because, we run these kind of new radio stations on YouTube, for example, and now how do you make it profitable? Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general have started opening the door to artists really making a living off of doing what they want to do. So that kind of stuff intrigues me. I don't know how it's going to become totally formalized, and if we can make money through this YouTube channel, for example, or some sort of movement, but I really like where it is going at the moment, and that speaks to the power of what cryptos represent and what Bitcoin in that first white paper detailed. Now, I want to talk about Nakamoto, because you say you're quite fond of the guy in the book, and that's what I like about Bitcoin and what we've seen from 2008 until now is that the cult of personality is not being able to corner Bitcoin. like people talk about Elon Musk and they talk about what he does to the price and all that kind of stuff, but he doesn't own Bitcoin, right? I mean, he can't crash it to the point where it crashes forever because it's now a decentralized exchange. So the cult of personality, do you see that being a problem for Bitcoin at the moment?
Not ultimately. As you alluded to, Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonymous character. Nobody knows for sure who he or she was. We refer to him as a he because Satoshi is a traditionally male name in Japan. Yeah. Satoshi was most likely a collaboration between Dave Kleiman, Hal Finney, and one or two other players. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that Satoshi Nakamoto can't be cancelled, can't be outed as part of Me Too exposure, can't die in a car accident, and can't influence the price of Bitcoin. We're all Satoshi now. The moment Bitcoin was launched and more than 2 people started using it, it took on a life of its own. So I think that lends Bitcoin a feature that's often overlooked and that no other cryptocurrency really has, is there's no founder to attack. People hear horrible stories about Steve Jobs and it changes how they feel about Apple. People read news stories about Vitalik Buterin dying in a car accident, which didn't happen, and the price of Ethereum tanks, because he's the founder or one of the founders. So I think it's very handy for Bitcoin that there isn't a personality to attach a cult to. Yes, there are people like Elon Musk who have a lot to say about Bitcoin. It's interesting, actually, and the media just fell for it hook, line, and sinker, the correlation between Elon Musk talking about Bitcoin and the price tanking. I think his impact on price movement is marginal at best because there were bigger stories around Bitcoin happening at the same time, specifically around the reserve crisis for the Tether stablecoin, which most Bitcoin trading relies on. That was a much bigger story than anything Elon Musk said, and not a single news or media outlet picked that up because it's boring, I suppose. Yeah. So much ado is made about Elon Musk's impact on the price of Bitcoin. It's all nonsense. Yeah. I think he made a dent, but it was a very small dent. Yeah. And of course, he also was very quick to add that Tesla hasn't sold any of its Bitcoin and they've stopped accepting it to buy cars. So what? Nobody was buying cars at Bitcoin. Like, come on.
There was a guy that was planning to, I'm pretty sure, out there somewhere.
I'm sure 1 or 2 people did, but let's be honest. Tesla makes its money from government carbon credits, and now it makes its money from holding Bitcoin. In fact, it's made more money holding Bitcoin for the last 6 months than it has from selling cars for 10 years. So
Well, no, that's something. But I like the technological development around Bitcoin and Ethereum because I see that there's a node, the first Ethereum node that's going to space. But I believe that Bitcoin's already in space, right? So tell me about these, developments where now, say the planet is obliterated in a nuclear bomb type of thing, but some places survive, right? In the future, World War III coming. You say that there's a way that you will then access Bitcoin and Ethereum through satellites and those kind of things. Yeah. So does that kind of stuff excite you? Explain where these things are.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because if you get to those kind of doomsday scenarios, we'll have a much better things to worry about than how to pay for sandwiches. So I don't think that that kind of extreme scenario is what's implied. But as you alluded to, there is a network of satellites. Most famously, Blockstream has a network of Bitcoin satellites that are essentially Bitcoin nodes running in space. One of the more interesting things about that is that you don't need the internet to access them. So if you've got a satellite dish and the right equipment, you can access the satellite directly and sync your Bitcoin node straight to the satellite. So, for example, let's imagine some doomsday scenario. There's a horrible flood or a war or whatever, and you're in a small village that's been cut off from the rest of the world and the internet. If you've got a satellite dish, you can hack it to tap into the Blockstream network. You can sync a node there. You can use that node to sync other nodes in the village, and you can set up your own kind of Bitcoin network, if you will, in that village, and you'll be able to have valid transactions syncing with blocks along with the rest of the world. So Bitcoin is sort of more anti-fragile in a way from that kind of development than I think a lot of people realize. You don't need an internet connection. You don't need a phone. You can use Bitcoin using paper wallets as well. It's quite interesting. But but yeah, having it in space is quite fascinating. Got this like record of human transactions that aliens might find one day and puzzle over.
Sure thing. But let's talk in South African terms that can be implemented today. As we wrap up here, I just want to get what you would recommend to a South African investor who now, or just a trader, or somebody who wants to now stash some cash into Bitcoin. Where should they start? Where did you start initially? What kind of advice would you give to them when they say, okay, well, I want to take the first step right now?
Well, I'd start by saying that nothing I say is financial advice and should not be listened to. It's purely entertainment. I'm not a financial advisor, so this is just my opinion. I also, as I said earlier, I'm kind of not interested in the investment hypothesis of these things and people just interested in making money. I mean, that's definitely a big part of the story, but it's just not that interesting to me. So the first thing I'd recommend is that, you don't spend money you're not willing to lose, because you could lose all your money. Let's be honest. Sure. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people in buying cryptocurrencies are gambling. They're trying to get rich quick, and that's just not how money works. So I would encourage people to think about that. Or, I personally wouldn't spend money I wasn't willing to lose. Secondly, the best places to start are in educating yourself. In the Bitcoin world, we say don't trust, verify, and that applies to everybody, including me. So don't listen to me, don't trust me. Go out and do your own research and make up your own mind. I've written a book that tries to explain some things, which is hopefully a useful tool. There's also fantastic resources online. One of the Bitcoin developers I admire is Jamison Lopp, and he's put together fantastic resources on his website that are available directly at his website, or you can go to hope.com. Which is the Bitcoin is Hope website, and also references a lot of Jamison Lopp's work, and you can go and do your own research. Fortunately, in South Africa, we have excellent exchanges and cryptocurrency companies. Luno is one of them. Valor, which you mentioned earlier, is another. So those are fantastic places to start learning as well.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So the Amazon link to the Kindle version of your book, I'll put in the description. There's probably a Take-A-Lot link as well. I'll add that as well.
Unfortunately, the physical paperback version is only available in South Africa, but Take-A-Lot, last I checked, had some stock. And Amazon Kindle anywhere else.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Well, thank you for writing the book. I think it's really a good resource for South Africans who need a quick crash course. I mean, very, very, very nicely paced, the book, and really just evidence from the years of development of Bitcoin. My brother, when he was in matric and I was 4 years younger than him, started talking to me about Bitcoin when I was probably, he was in matric and I was 4 years below him. And I started, I was dumbfounded by this thing that he was talking about. He actually started mining some Bitcoin in the early days on his computer, type of thing. And to this day, we don't know how to go and access that thing. He doesn't remember where he stored it. And I would say there was a good amount of Bitcoin mined on our little computer at home, much to the dismay of my dad. So take me back, final question, to the first time you heard about Bitcoin. How did you get into this, and what did you start doing with Bitcoin? Did you do some mining yourself?
I didn't in the beginning. The first time I heard about it was in 2010. I was at a debate between two economists that were basically talking about gold. And a friend of mine who invited me to this debate asked me if I'd heard of Bitcoin. So I hadn't, and I went and did some research and found out about it. I didn't really get involved with it too much until 2011. I wrote a cover story for FinWeek magazine that year about Bitcoin. I compiled the Bitcoin core software on my computer and started playing around with it. By that stage, it was already too late to be mining Bitcoin on your personal computer. You already needed to be, I think at that stage, we were going through the GPU stage before ASICs took over. So I started using it, started playing around with it, found some local guys who were mining it in Pretoria and Johannesburg. Didn't buy a lot myself, unfortunately. I was more just intrigued with the technology and what it meant and where it was going. And the rest is history. I was on the founding team at BitX, which is now Luno. Started my own companies in the space. Found out about Ethereum very early on. So I was running Ethereum Frontier on my laptop, running a Geth node. So very involved in Ethereum as well since before it launched. and have just been having an absolute ball watching a new financial system emerge from this all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's still early days in South Africa, and that's why most guys out there are like, well, let's
everywhere.
Yeah, well, even in the United States, who are trying to say, trust the dollar, don't trust the Bitcoin. It's very inefficient, they claim, but we'll see what happens in that fight long term. Anyways, at Simon Dingle on Twitter, go and follow him. Simon, thank you for coming on the show. It was great to have you.
Pleasure, Quintus. Thanks for having me.
All right, cheerio. Bye-bye.
Cheers.